everybody, and welcome into the second floor of the Duncan Student Center. What did we learn last week?
Well, even without Ian Book, the Irish were still able to get it done. So a win's a win.
Irish came out strong in the first half, and maybe not all of our fans made it through the second half, but our players sure did. Like you said, an Irish win's a win.
Yep.
Hello, I'm Father John Jenkins, President of the University of Notre Dame, and thank you for watching Shamrock Sports.
Second and 8. Passes intercepted. The deflection. It's Nick Coleman inside the 10. Runs it in.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back inside the second floor of the Duncan Student Center and Shamrock Sports. Austin Rooney alongside Ellen Geyer and Jess Jordan. And a big win for Notre Dame last week over the Florida State Seminoles.
Big win for the Irish. I think going into the game we were all a little bit skeptical about how Brandon Wimbush would show up. But this is one of those guys that took his time from the bench and really developed as a player. I think it's remarkable to see. He's a great athlete. He's a great leader. He came out looking strong, and he carried the Irish as he continued their trajectory as a college football playoff-ready team. And I think that's huge.
It was great to see Wimbush back in the game, especially during November. As we know with our Irish history, November's not always a strong month, but we're getting through it so far, and Wimbush carried us to a victory. Nobody was really quite sure what to think, but he played well. Maybe not as well as some people were hoping, but he got through the game and led us to a win.
Well, you mentioned Brandon Wimbush. He played well, but how well did he really play, though? He was 12 for 25 with his completion percentage under 50%. He did throw 3 touchdowns. He had a couple picks, though, to go along with it.
I think we've gotten a little bit spoiled with Ian Book, to be honest. I think we're getting a little bit greedy. You know, Brandon Wimbush sat at, what, a 48% completion rate? And what Book's been putting up video game numbers, to quote John Horlander, at about 70% completion rate. So I think he had a really solid performance in terms of where a college football quarterback should be. So I think we should be pretty happy with where Brandon was. Again, this is a trend we've seen with the whole Notre Dame team where he played very well in the first half, didn't come out so strong in the second half, but I think that that's something that we can fix.
I agree with that completely. It might not be a totally fair comparison to say Wimbush didn't play exactly like Ian Book, because most college quarterbacks right now aren't playing exactly like Ian Book. But he did what he had to do to get it done. Like you said, first half was stronger than the second half. That's something the Irish are going to have to keep up with in the next couple weeks, playing a 4-quarter game.
Well, moving forward, I guess, with Brandon Wimbush, should they need him again, whether it be in the college football playoff or later on, do you trust him down the road as a quarterback for Notre Dame?
I do. I think he really showed his strength last weekend. I know he was a little bit wary, or a little bit not as strong towards the end of the game, but I think he's a solid guy, and I think that's something that we can take away from this as a very positive thing as Irish fans, is that if Ian Book is in a situation where he can't play, Wimbush is right there to back him up. And something that Brian Kelly has really emphasized in his press conferences is some players are not there yet. I think Brandon Wimbush maybe isn't there yet, but if he has that starting role and he needs to get there, I'm confident that he'll be able to do it.
Exactly. This whole season hasn't just been Ian Book. We started with Wimbush, we ended with Wimbush this past weekend, and everything's gone okay so far. I think he still has some room to develop, but he's been playing well the past couple games, or this game and earlier in the season, and I think we'll continue to see that growth through the rest of the season if we need to rely on him.
Yeah.
Now, one of the other key positions for the Fighting Irish has been the offensive line. There have been a lot of question marks surrounding that offensive line in past weeks. They have struggled. Last week they looked pretty good, though, and Dexter Williams performed well. They gave Brandon Wimbush time to scramble and time to pass the football.
I thought the offensive line was lights out last week. They had a season low. They allowed Florida State a season low 61 tackles. They haven't let the other team get a sack in the past 3 games. So they've just been completely carrying this Irish team, I think. And I think that's something we take for granted because the offensive line guys aren't the ones that are getting into the end zone. But I think that it's their performance that's ultimately leading us to be the kind of team that we are.
I exactly agree with your point that they're not always the ones getting the credit, but they're definitely behind us getting the points we're getting our wins. They're pushing our plays down the field and doing what they need to do.
As far as Dexter Williams goes specifically, he had his career high, 202 yards on the ground, 20 rushes. It was a really good performance from Dexter Williams. What were you think about him specifically and moving down the road?
Yeah, Dex had almost 3 times more yards than the next leading rusher, who was Brandon Wimbush himself. So I think that he's really been an integral part of this offense. And even though he missed those first couple of games of the season, he's still emerged as the highest rusher on the Irish team. So I think that's just a testament to his ability to adapt. I think he's really given something super dynamic to this Irish offense.
Yes, the first couple games, obviously the Irish still won, but we were missing him. And when Dex came back into the picture, the Irish just took off, and he's been keeping that performance up throughout the whole season. Had a great game this past weekend. Hopefully he'll do the same at Syracuse.
Well, this past weekend was senior day for Notre Dame. It was their last home game of the season. It's technically a home game this weekend as they're taking on Syracuse in Yankee Stadium, but we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But let's keep it with senior day here for the Irish back at Notre Dame Stadium. A couple players had really big games. You look at Alize Mack and Chris Fink, Miles Boykin, the receivers came up big, and then the 2 players you mentioned earlier, Brandon Wimbush along with Dexter Williams, all seniors, and they had big games.
Yeah, I think something really special was what the Irish last week was what the Irish were able to do in that senior day environment. Chris Fink came up as the leading receiver. Obviously, Brandon Wimbush carried the offense. I think they had really strong guys on the D-line, on the O-line. Obviously, there were other receivers like Boykin. I think that putting them in that environment, you know, the excitement gets so high. It's your last home game. You're undefeated at home so far. It's senior day. There's so much to play for, and I think something really positive that came out of that is when the stakes did get so high, the guys still showed up. So I think that's really positive, and the way that they played on senior day, I think, is a testament to the character that all these guys have and what their love for Notre Dame is.
Our seniors this week played as a team. They played as leaders, and while nobody was happy with Book's injury, it did allow Wimbush to come in for that senior night. He was one of, 32 guys we celebrated this past weekend as seniors, and they showed up. They did what they needed to do.
One player I'd like to focus on is Alize Mack. We've seen some of him throughout the season, but he had 2 touchdowns this past weekend in a huge night for the tight end.
Yeah, I think that's something that's looked really good for Notre Dame this year has been that tight end play where they just kind of toss it off on that counter play. And I think Mack has been that guy, that go-to guy, him and Nick Weischer. I think that we saw that really strongly last week against Florida State, being able to get into the end zone that way, even when you are a bigger guy, you're not the receiver. I think that's something that really will carry us through and be a really strong asset for this Notre Dame team in the future.
Exactly. He was there when we needed him to be. I don't have anything else to say about that, but
that's all
he did his job.
And now moving from the offense to the defensive side of the ball, Notre Dame did quite well, especially containing DeAndre Francois, who threw under 50% for Florida State.
Yeah. They had several guys that came out with really strong total tackles. We had Alohi Gilman with 10 tackles. We had Julian Love with 9 tackles. We had Tavon Coney with 7 tackles. They obviously forced an interception on Florida State, started the game out really strong with that interception run down back to the end zone for a touchdown. I think that's been something that's really been key is also the Irish defense that we've seen.
Yes, and what a great way to start the game. Just that got the energy up on the field, in the stadium, and our defense continued that energy through the game with Jerry Tillery, like you said, Coney, Drew Tranquil. All these guys had a great game and held FSU to a low score like they needed to do.
And I think something that is really positive that came out from last week's game is that our coverage actually looked good for once.
It did.
I think something that we've struggled with the whole season has been our coverage has been absolutely terrible. And I think this Florida State was a strong team. They were a pass-first team, and we were able to really shut it down. And I think that's something really positive that we can take away.
I agree.
The passing defense looked really good for the Irish. Moving from passing defense to special teams, the Irish came up big in their special teams this past week, and in the past, special teams have been something that the Irish have struggled with.
Yes, the special teams also another thing that finally looked good that we can take away. We only had to punt the ball 2 times last week, and although there were a couple interceptions in there, 2 punts, I'll take that. I think we scored on the first 5 drives of the game, and that last drive was a punt, and I think that's something really positive. I thought it was a remarkable performance from the special teams, especially since that's been kind of a point of trouble in the past.
Exactly, and returning that blocked extra point for another 2 just put the icing on the cake. A great game for our special teams.
Definitely.
The special teams clearly performed well, and now let's take a look at what happened around college football. With more on that, we send it down to Caroline Pineda.
I'm Caroline Pineda, and here's what happened in college football this week. Number 1, Alabama shut out its second straight ranked opponent, beating number 16 Mississippi State 24-0. The Tide only allowed 169 yards of total offense and 44 yards on the ground. Number 17, Boston College, hung in this one with number 2, Clemson, despite quarterback Anthony Brown leaving the game on the first possession. Clemson only led 13-7 at the half, but scored early in the third on a 6-yard touchdown run by quarterback Trevor Lawrence. They went up 20-7 on that play and scored once more to win that one 27-7. Number 4, Michigan stomped Rutgers 42-7 to remain perfect in the Big Ten. They opened up a 14-point lead at the half and ended up scoring the last 35 points of the game. Number 5, Georgia cruised by number 24, Auburn 27-10. DeAndre Swift broke away to seal this one with a 77-yard touchdown run early in the fourth quarter. He rushed for 186 yards and 1 touchdown in the contest. Number 10, Ohio State didn't allow a touchdown and beat number 18, Michigan State 26-6. Shaun Wade picked this one off, and Mike Weber capped off this scoring drive with a 2-yard touchdown run to go up 26-6 late in the fourth. This week, Notre Dame is the only top 10 team with a ranked opponent. Number 1, Alabama will face the Citadel. Number 2, Clemson takes on Duke. And number 4, Michigan will meet Indiana. That's what happened in college football this week. I'm Caroline Pineda. Let's get back to talking about the Irish.
Welcome back inside the second floor of the Duncan Student Center, and Notre Dame's got a tough test this weekend versus Syracuse. But before we talk about Notre Dame, let's talk about some of the other teams in the college football playoff. Alabama still sits at number 1 in the country.
Yeah. Alabama seems to be on another planet these days. They're playing the Citadel this week. The Citadel actually has a 0.1% win chance. I know that could be a little bit generous, not just giving Alabama the 100% win rate, but obviously easy win for Alabama this week. But I think something to watch for is obviously they've got Auburn next week. I mean, Auburn's not having a stellar season themselves, but you know, the rivalry games, things always get going, the energy gets high. But then looking even further into the future, they've got Georgia in the SEC championship game, and I think that's really the biggest test that the Tide will have for the rest of the season. So hopefully the Bulldogs will be able to get something done, knock Alabama out. I think that'd make all of us Irish fans happy.
Absolutely. Sitting at number 2 in the CFP is Clemson. They've got Duke and South Carolina left. Should be a coast through the rest of the season for them. Earlier in the season, they had a win over Syracuse. Says something for them, for us. Undefeated.
Yeah.
They're sitting pretty. Not much anybody can do to stop them at this point.
And then obviously our old foe Michigan sits at number 4. They're 9-1, only team in the top 4 that's not undefeated. They'll have they shouldn't have too much trouble with Indiana this weekend, but in 2 weeks obviously they've got that Ohio State game circled in red on their schedule, I'm sure. And it's been a couple years since they beat the Buckeyes, so I'm sure they'll be anxious to win. And I think if they win that game, obviously they're shoo-in for the playoffs. So we'll see how that shakes out.
Well, that seems to be right. The last team that we were missing on the outside, Georgia, they're currently ranked number 5 in the country. Georgia's going to have a shot to play Alabama in that SEC championship game. What are you going to see for that game?
I think that's going to be a great game to watch. I think it's going to be high intensity. I think both teams have a lot to play for. Both really playing for a spot in the college football playoff. So I think that's going to be one of the best games we'll see before the playoff for the rest of the season.
Absolutely. The word on the street right now is that Georgia's got a stronger pass defense than a run defense, but we'll see how they shape up against Alabama and go from there.
Yeah.
Is there any way that Notre Dame ends this season undefeated? Let's say Georgia beats Alabama. Is there any way Notre Dame does not end up in the college football playoff if they go undefeated?
No, because your point, it could be Georgia, and I think another team that would be put before Notre Dame would be Michigan. But when you look at the head-to-head matchup, we beat Michigan fair and square in September. So I think that really when you compare the two teams, the best thing you can do is compare when they play each other. And since Notre Dame beat Michigan, I don't see an undefeated Notre Dame team being left out of the top 4.
I agree with that 100%. I think the biggest competitor for that spot would be Michigan. But like you said, as we've beaten them head-to-head, there's not much anybody can do about that. Some people have tried to make the argument that Michigan's season has been on the up and up since then, but the game's the game.
Yeah.
The game's the game, and Notre Dame has won every single game. They've got quite a tough schedule themselves. It's my opinion, at least, that Notre Dame's schedule is underrated. They played a lot of good opponents between Virginia Tech and Stanford, who were ranked at the time, and now it's a matchup versus Syracuse this weekend. They beat Michigan. These are some really top-level wins. I'm surprised Notre Dame's only at 3. I could see them contending for number 2, at least in terms of strength of schedule.
Yeah, I could definitely see that as well. I think sometimes these ACC, SEC teams get a little bit more credit, in my opinion, than they actually deserve. I think Notre Dame's faced a lot of really solid opponents this year. Michigan, you mentioned Stanford. I think even the games coming up, if they're able to win, those are strong opponents. Syracuse, obviously sitting at number 12, and then USC even though they're not ranked. I think that's always a tough game for the Irish, especially since it's going to be out in California. So I agree with you. I think Notre Dame's had a really strong schedule this year, and I think that they haven't been given all the credit they deserve, maybe in that respect.
And we won't have a show next week because it's over Thanksgiving break, so I'd like to take a look ahead before we talk about Syracuse and take a look at USC. USC is 2 weeks away from the Fighting Irish. If they win versus Syracuse this weekend, they'd have that matchup versus USC next weekend. What do you see in that game? Of course, it's on the road in Southern California. How do you see Notre Dame being able to play against their arch rival?
I think that the Irish have really been improving all season, and I think USC is, again, one of those games you circle on the calendar. You say it's a big rivalry game, obviously traveling all the way to California. The Irish have been doing so much traveling in the back half of their season, but I think that where the Irish are now and where USC is right now, I don't think it's a contest. I think Notre Dame should be able to come away with an easy win, and if they don't, it'd be for some sort of reason, some sort of fluke. That wouldn't really be because USC is the better team.
I agree with that. At the very beginning of our season, we talked about USC as potentially being a really big game for the Irish, but as the fall has progressed, we've seen USC not performing at the standard we expected, and the Irish have obviously gone undefeated. I think USC could be seen possibly as a trap game, but I think the Irish will come out with the win. I'm sure they'll be glad to be playing somewhere sunny and warm as opposed to here or in New York.
Certainly.
But I think it's an Irish win for sure.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about USC. We've looked at the upcoming schedule. We've talked for the college football playoff, but there's one game that's in front of Notre Dame, and it's their biggest game left on the schedule. That's Syracuse, and with more on that game, we send it down to Charlie McFadden.
Hi, I'm Charlie McFadden, and here's the 3 keys to Notre Dame's matchup versus Syracuse this weekend. 1. Start quick on defense. Last week, the Irish opened up their first drive on defense with an interception by Nick Coleman that led to a touchdown. As the Irish face off against a talented Syracuse quarterback in Eric Dungy this week, they would benefit from a quick start on D. The Irish are one of the most elite defenses in the nation this year, as they've allowed just over 4 yards per play. That'll be put to the test this week against an explosive Syracuse offense. 2. Protect the ball. With Ian Book returning from an injury this week, he'll need to be back at his best and avoid turning the ball over to give the Irish their best chance to win. Book is the 4th most efficient passer in college football this year, and the Irish offense is lethal with him at the helm. If the Irish want to pick up their 11th victory, Book will need to be a leader for this team on Saturday. 3. Stay healthy. Yankee Stadium is notorious for getting players injured, and with the Irish on the brink of a college football playoff, it is imperative they keep their bodies healthy and prepare for an impending postseason. I'm Charlie McFadden, and these have been the 3 keys to Notre Dame's matchup for Syracuse this weekend. Back to you guys in the studio.
Thanks so much, Charlie. And we take a look at this Syracuse matchup. Syracuse has won 4 straight games. They're a pretty intimidating team.
Syracuse had a great season. It's hard to say as an Irish fan, but they've won their last 5 games with high scores. Their past 5 wins, I mean. They won 51-41 versus NC State, 41-24 versus Wake Forest, and 54-23 against Louisville last weekend. Their coach, though, is seeing this game this coming week a little differently. He said it's a freebie. They're not playing, it's not a conference game, so they don't have that to worry about. And it's not going to affect their conference standings, but it's still going to be a challenge for them, and we'll have to see how that offense stacks up against our defense.
Yeah, and I think something that we can't look past is that Syracuse is such an upset-minded team. 2 years ago, they spoiled Virginia Tech's season. Last year, they spoiled Clemson's season. They almost spoiled Clemson's season again this year. They really have that hunger, and although they're not necessarily one of the top 4 teams in college football, they're always one of those teams that you have to look out for. This isn't a game that you can look past as an easy win. They're going to come to New York. They're undefeated in New York. They haven't lost at home. Obviously, we're not at Syracuse, but it's to say, I think they're a really solid team.
Miles away.
But still, that's not something that we can look past. Obviously, they're the team with the best schedule in terms of Irish opponents at 8-2, besides Michigan. So I think that this is really a game that I'm nervous for.
And while Zeno Babers is saying it's a freebie game, it could affect their bowl perspectives for the rest of the season. They've got us and Boston College left. They're 8-2. If they go 10-2, they're sitting pretty for the New Year's Bowl, but if not, that may not be the story anymore.
Yeah, 10-2, Syracuse, you'd have to think they'd be top 10, possibly even getting close to top 5 at that rate. But moving from that, I mean, they played good teams atop college football. We mentioned Clemson, they're second ranked in the country right now. They played that game on the road and still only lost by 4 points. So they've done well against tough opponents.
Yeah, I think they've had a really strong season so far. That Clemson game you mentioned, obviously that's huge for them. And they lost to Pitt. That was kind of a throwaway game. Again, like a fluke, something that is not necessarily telling of what kind of team they really are. They have a solid team that's anchored by veterans. They've got 4 guys who are 4-year starters on their offensive line. Obviously, they've got their quarterback is a senior. He's really anchored their offense for a long time. So I think that they have a lot of solid, positive things in every department. So I think that Notre Dame really needs to be firing on all cylinders this week.
I agree with that. We talked a little bit about their quarterback, Eric Dungy. His passing completion percentage isn't Ian Book's, but it's up there. He's sitting at 60.4% for the season, so he's going to be a threat to the Irish defense. But that being said, they haven't really played a defense as strong as the Irish yet this season, so we'll see what that matchup looks like this weekend.
You mentioned Eric Dungy, the starting quarterback for Syracuse. He's a dual-threat quarterback. He scored 14 touchdowns through the air. He's had 12 touchdowns on the ground. He's actually the second leading rusher for Syracuse as a whole. Has Notre Dame dealt with a dual-threat quarterback like Dungy this season?
I don't know exactly if you can compare the quarterbacks between different teams just because they've got different lines, different receivers, that sort of thing. But obviously we saw that Navy triple option offense. I think that's not necessarily, when you've got kind of 3 quarterbacks running things, it's not necessarily one dual threat guy. But I think that Dungy, what he brings to the table is kind of similar to the dual threat Navy triple option with in terms of passing, rushing, pitching, that sort of thing, not really knowing what you're going to see. So I think that we saw that the Irish defense has a really good reaction time. And so I think that even though Dungy is a dual threat, if he tries to do that quarterback sneak down the middle, even like a jet sweep handoff, that sort of thing, the Irish defense is going to be ready for that.
I think that Navy comparison's a really good place to start because they were a team that could do a little bit of everything, and we were able to handle that. But along those same lines, it's going to have to be a 4-quarter game. The Irish need to play all 4 quarters. Syracuse is a high-scoring team, so we can't start off strong and then kind of taper off after halftime. We need to keep pushing on offense and defense to keep Syracuse down and push ourselves up.
Syracuse averaging 44 points per game. And Brian Kelly said that this is the strongest special teams that we're going to see, that we've seen or will see the rest of the season. So I think there's definitely a lot of factors that we need to address as an Irish offense.
And going back to that offense, Notre Dame has Ian Book back this weekend. What is that going to do for Notre Dame versus Syracuse?
I think that's morale. I think you get your dog back in the fight. Obviously, that boosts up the whole Irish offense. He'll find his favorite receiver, Miles Boykin, again. Obviously, last week we saw a huge rushing game, very minimal passing game. Ian Book likes to do a little bit more passing than Brandon Wimbush does. So I think we're going to see more of the spread and good receivers. Probably more performance, more emphasis on Boykin and Claypool as opposed to, Armstrong and Dexter Williams.
Absolutely. And if we're seeing Ian Book back in the game, it's going to be a little more of an even comparison between Book and Dungy because they'll be doing both passing and rushing.
Certainly.
And going back to that rushing game with Dexter Williams, he had a big game last weekend. Can we expect the same out of Dexter Williams this week? I know you mentioned that you think it's going to be slightly fewer rushes for him, but do you still see a big game out of Williams?
I think he's one of those guys that no matter how many times he gets the ball, he always seems to be able to break the field open. So I think if we continue to have a solid offensive line like we have, Williams, even if he doesn't get as many carries, I think he shouldn't really struggle getting as many yards as he has.
I agree with that. He's had such a strong season. He's been consistently performing the way we hope to see him perform. And I think no matter how many times he's getting the ball this game, he will do well with what he has.
And specifically regarding Notre Dame's offense and how it matches up against that Syracuse defense, do you think Notre Dame's going to be able to put up a lot of points against the Syracuse defense?
I think this is a solid Syracuse defense. I think it's one of the better ones we've seen. Obviously, they're just a better team in general than what we're kind of used to. But I think that the Notre Dame offense shouldn't have too much trouble because they've kind of fallen into this routine of, solid performance from the offensive line, good performance from the receivers, obviously, everyone doing their job. So I think as long as Notre Dame can continue to do what it has done, I don't see this game being an issue, although Syracuse is definitely a better opponent than what we've seen lately.
Absolutely. I think as a team, Notre Dame's kind of gotten into a rhythm. They've been doing well consistently, and we should see that in this game, both on the offense and defense. It won't be a super strong offense game specifically or defense game. I think it's going to have to be a mixture of both because, like we said, Syracuse is high scoring, so we're going to have to stop that but also match that.
Yeah.
I would like to touch on the offense for Syracuse one more time before we move on here, and that's regarding Mo Neal, who is the running back for Syracuse.
Yes.
He's their starting running back. He's been really good this season for Syracuse. How is Notre Dame going to be able to manage to deal with Mo Neal and still work with that dual threat option with Eric Dungy?
I think that a good comparison for us is the way that Notre Dame was able to shut down Saquon Barkley again in Stanford. Or they were really able to shut him down. It was really, he wasn't able to get runs up the middle, that sort of thing. They really kind of contained that. So I think if they can contain the run the same way, they should be in good shape.
I agree. If our defense plays the way they've been playing, I don't think we should have a problem. He might be a stronger threat than what we faced the past few weeks, but I think it's something the Irish can handle for sure.
Yeah.
Well, moving forward from football over into hockey, Notre Dame currently ranked 8th in the country. They are 5-4-1 this season. They have had a couple of tough losses this season, though. One of them was this past weekend against arch rival Michigan. And Notre Dame lost game 1 on Friday versus Michigan. That was a 2-1 loss. But they came back the following night, won 6-2 over the Wolverines. Now, there's been a lot of changes this season from last season for Notre Dame. They lose 2 of their top scorers, Jake Evans and Andrew Ogilvie, who were their number 1 and the number 2 centers for the Irish, went to the NHL. So it's still early in the season, but there have been guys who have picked up the slack this season. Cal Burke is one of them. He leads his team in goals, 6 goals, 7 assists. Their top defenseman, top offensive defenseman at least that is, Bobby Nardella, has registered 12 points to go right along with it. And another player who stepped up, who was playing third-line minutes last year, sometimes even fourth-line minutes, is Joe Wegworth. And Wegworth is averaging 1 point per game. He has 10 points in 10 games. It's been a really strong season for Joe Wegworth. So moving forward in the schedule for the Fighting Irish, they have Michigan State this upcoming weekend, and they return home to Compton Family Ice Arena the following weekend, and that will be versus Northern Michigan, and then they take on RPI after that. Notre Dame has struggled a little bit against some of the tougher teams on the schedule. They lost both games versus Minnesota Duluth. They lost 1 game versus Ohio State and 1 game versus Michigan. Those are their 4 losses, and they're all against ranked opponents. But they've taken care of opponents who are not ranked in the top 25. Earlier this season, they took on Nebraska Omaha. That was a pretty easy win for the Fighting Irish. So we'll see if they can continue to find success against non-conference or non-top 25 opponents such as Northern Michigan, RPI, and this weekend versus Michigan State. In other non-football news, we're going to take a look at the basketball team. This past week, they had a tough loss versus Radford.
Yeah, that's absolutely brutal. You hate to see that kind of performance from the Irish, but I do think it's a product of them getting their legs under them. Obviously, you're missing several key players this year with all those guys that graduated. So I think that it makes sense that the Irish are struggling the way that they are. But I still don't see how they're dropping these games against opponents like Radford. Obviously, they played UIC. They had Chicago State. The Chicago State game was, even though they won, that was not a good game. They didn't shoot well. They didn't play very well. Even at halftime, the score was very close. I think that this team is going to have to just continue to develop. They're going to continue to need leadership from guys like Rex Pfluger, TJ Gibbs, obviously. And then last night, that game, John Mooney really carried the offense. He was really the only reason the Irish were competitive. The rest of the team was shooting terribly, besides Mooney. So I think that these are kinks that the Irish should be able to work out as the season wears on. Obviously, they've got a lot of young guys that they're starting to rely on. But I think that the win or the loss that they suffered last night, in my opinion, that's inexcusable.
I agree with that. It might not be the season we've hoped for yet, but it's still early. Like you said, it's a developing year. More than that, it's even a rebuilding year for the Irish. Like you said, lots of young players. I hope we see better in the future, but I'm sure they're going to keep improving and kind of get their feet under them as the season continues. It's still early. They've got time to figure it out.
Especially losing guys like Matt Farrell, Bonzi Colson. Between the two of them, they led almost every category on the team. Points, rebounds, assists, all those things. So losing 2 guys like that, even though the Irish were able to overcome some injury last year, there's still definitely a lot of growing pains that are happening with this team, I think.
Well, you mentioned injury, and Bonzi Colson was gone for the entire second half of the season. Matt Farrell was gone for much of the second half of the season. You'd have to think that helps them at least so they have some chemistry with the current unit.
Yeah, I think that does help because some of the younger guys did get to play, but like another piece that was missing was DJ Harvey. He was out for most of the season, or the back half of the season from about January or so on. So I think seeing guys like him who are finally recovering, it's great to see him back on the court. He's a huge part of the Notre Dame offense, but obviously he hasn't really had that much time with his teammates in real game experience. So I think that it is kind of everyone, even the older guys. Some of the guys who were injured last year, they really haven't had that much time on the court. Obviously, the younger guys haven't had time on the court. So I think that that's really a big part of how the Irish are playing right now.
Exactly. And someone else we haven't seen yet this season is Juwan Durham. He hasn't played much. He couldn't play last year due to eligibility, but we're expecting big things from him this season, and I'm hoping we see that moving forward as he gets more time on the court.
Yeah.
Yeah, another player again, John Rooney, as you mentioned. What do you see from him this season? Can he become one of the top players on this Notre Dame team? Of course, Bonzie Colson graduating. Can he be that next Bonzie Colson for the Irish?
Absolutely. I think Mooney's he's strong on the perimeter. He's strong in the post. Yesterday, he was the only guy who was hitting three-pointers, and I think the way that he is able to shoot from the outside and get on the inside, he reminds me a little bit of Kevin Love, who's playing in the NBA. Just that strong perimeter player that you don't really necessarily look to as the face of your team, but he's one of those guys that you really rely on, and you don't realize it until you take it out of the equation.
I think reliable is that best word for him. He's been consistent, and like you said, you're not always looking directly to him, but he's there when you need him to be, and he's comfortable on the court.
Yeah.
And that's what really matters.
Well, you mentioned, of course, T.J. Gibbs and John Mooney, that relationship between the point guard and the power forward and how well they can work together. Is there one other player, whether it's a freshman or somebody else, who you think is going to be a standout this season we haven't really seen much of yet this year?
For me, it's DJ Harvey. I think he unfortunately wasn't able to showcase his skills last year, but I think he's a dynamic player. He is really able to get things started on defense. He has the power to, take strong drives in on the offense. He should be able to shoot from the perimeter, although we haven't really seen it so far this season. But I think he's one of those guys that really we should be able to rely on in the future.
Exactly. I think for me personally, it's too early to tell. There's so many new guys on this team. They're so young. But as the season develops in the next couple weeks, I think we'll see some of them kind of start to stand out from the rest and see where we go from there.
One last point on basketball here. The freshman who's gotten the most playing time and who's really developed, we've seen Prentice Hubb, who is the point guard for the Fighting Irish. He's almost taken that role over from T.J. Gibbs. T.J. Gibbs moving into more of that number 2 role, the shooting guard role. What have you seen from Prentice Hubb so far this season?
I think Prentice Hubb is one of those guys who's been solid, but again, with the perimeter shooting, this is a theme for the whole team. This is something that Hubb has to work on too. I think that playing in college is just a different game. Like, you get into high school, you get into AAU, obviously it's very competitive, you're playing against big guys, but the college system just works a little bit differently. I think he's going to have to adjust to the way the Irish play defense. He's obviously going to have to get used to shooting under maybe a little bit better pressure than he's used to, but ultimately he's got the ball handling skills, he's got the shooting ability, he can adapt. That's something that we should be able to see from him. I think it's a learning curve, it's growing pains. I think that the Irish are going to need a little bit of time to get there.
I agree with that. Adjustment's going to be a key for all these new guys on the team this year as they're learning to develop, playing in a new environment, and getting used to new teammates. As they come together, I think we will see them start to have more success in the future as they get more comfortable with themselves on the court and who they're playing with.
And before we close the show out, we're going to return to some football, and let's get some predictions for this upcoming game versus Syracuse. What do you see from these two teams this year?
I think that the Irish offensive line is going to come out strong. They're going to stay consistent. Ian Book obviously wasn't able to play last week. I think he comes out with a little bit of fire, a little bit of intensity, maybe a little bit of disappointment from last week kind of carrying over as energy this week. I think that the Irish defense is going to show up again. Hopefully that good coverage will continue, especially since it's such a big opponent. I think that the Irish defense will be fired up, ready to go. Jerry Tillery, things like that. So I think my prediction for final score, 21-35, Irish win this one.
I think it's going to be a great game. I see the Irish coming out strong even against an opponent who's probably a little better than what we've seen the past couple weeks. I think Syracuse is going to go ahead and score a lot of points, but we're going to be ready to match that. I say 42-35 Irish.
All right, so both of you have a couple of wins for the Irish. We'll have to see what happens. To watch this game or to listen to this game, you can see two of our normal hosts. You have Caroline Pineda and John Horlander, who will be calling the game from Yankee Stadium. You can watch that on wvfi.nd.edu. So from Austin Rooney, Ellen Geyer, and Jess Jordan, we say so long from the second floor of the Duncan Student Center.
All night.